Psalm 34, if you have it, you can turn there in your Bible. If you don't have a Bible, you can slip up your hand, and we'd love to give you a Bible to read this morning. And on the subject of printed Bibles, we have an amazing resource available for you out in the foyer if you are so interested. Our high school students have already had access to these, and we just got our shipment in for you guys, the grown-ups. This is a journal of the Psalms only. It's printed by Crossway. It is the English Standard Version, which is the standard or the translation that I typically preach from. And if you notice, this has all the Psalms in it with, on the opposite side, a fully blank page where you can keep notes. And so as we're journeying through this incredible book of Psalms, if you would like to journal, not only on these sermons, but also just to have a repository for your interaction with these sacred words, we really recommend pick up one of these. You can order them online, but we got a bulk shipment, so we can sell them for $5, which is pretty inexpensive, just at cost for us. And we'd love for you to have that as a resource as you develop your own sort of user's guide to the Psalms, and let the Psalms be a user's guide for your life. So, Psalm 34. Oh, also, if your note sheet, as always, down at the bottom, if you have prayer requests or praises, feel free to fill out that connection card, and then you tear it off, and you can drop that in the offering plate when it goes by after the sermon. But as you're there, turning to Psalm 34, I want to ask you a rhetorical question, which means you don't have to answer it out loud or by raising your hand or by stomping your feet or what other kind of external way you would use to respond. But a rhetorical question. Think about this. Ponder. How much fear do you personally manage on a daily basis? And then, second rhetorical question, how would you like to live fear-free? Now, in the Psalms, there's a lot about fear. But today's psalm, the 34th psalm, is actually tied with Psalm 119, that psalm of 176 verses, the giant long psalm. Psalm 34 is tied with Psalm 119 as the psalm with the single most references to the word fear. It's got 5 in its 22 verses. And if you're looking at Psalm 34 up at the top, before you even get into the lines of the poem itself, you notice it is a psalm of David. Let's think for a moment about King David. If you know the stories of King David, what kind of man was he? Obviously, the skillful shepherd, killing the lion and the bear to protect his flock. The bold warrior who runs to the battle line to confront the giant Goliath. The gifted poet whose words we're still reading today. The anointed king. All kinds of positive things come to mind with David. Some negative things may also come to mind. The brazen adulterer, the scheming murderer, the conflicted father. But I don't know about for you. For me, one thing that does not come to mind when I think of David is fearful. I mean, what put him on the map was pretty much being the only guy in all Israel who was not afraid of Goliath, the giant. Maybe you remember the scene, 1 Samuel 17. Goliath is taunting and boasting in the showdown between the Philistines and the Israelites. Goliath says, if anyone will come out and slay me, then we'll give you the whole victory. But there's no soldier in all Israel who will fight Goliath. And so David, the errand boy, the youngest in the family, comes to drop off some brown bags of lunch for his brothers. And he hears the taunts, and he says, why isn't anybody fighting? And they're all like, we're scared of that guy. He's like 9 feet tall. And so David goes to Saul, gets permission, goes to the battle line, and he's standing there like a teenage boy across from this terrifying champion. And the Goliath like taunts him, and David just talks trash right back. He said, you came to me with a sword and a spear and a javelin, but I come to you in the name of the Lord. And then he says to Goliath, I am going to cut off your head, and then I'm going to feed your army to the birds so that everyone knows there's a God in Israel. That's graphic, that's violent. It's not fearful. And of course, we know David does just that. Strikes Goliath with a stone from his sling, then cuts off his head, and then routs the army. And if you're reading through the stories of King David in 1 and 2 Samuel, it's interesting. There's only one time when it expressly says that David is afraid of another person. And it's in 1 Samuel 21, and I put a little excerpt of it on your notes sheet right up at the top. And it's this interesting scene where David has come to the city of Gath, where there's a king named Achish in charge. And David essentially knocks on the door at the gate, seeking asylum. But there's a wrinkle in the plan, because the servants of Achish, in verse 11, said to Achish, isn't that guy knocking at the door? Isn't that David, the king of the land? And didn't they sing to one another in dances that Saul has struck down his thousands, but David his 10,000s? And David took these words to heart and was much afraid of Achish, the king of Gath. So he changed his behavior before them and pretended to be insane in their hands, and made marks on the doors of the gate and let his spittle run down his beard. You gotta love some of these Old Testament images. Frothing at the mouth. Then Achish said to his servants, behold, you see the man is mad. Why then have you brought him to me? Do I lack madmen that you have brought this fellow to behave as a madman in my presence? Shall this fellow come into my house? And so the king says, I've got enough crazy people in my government. I don't need one more. But it's interesting. Of all the situations in David's life, and certainly he felt the emotions of fear and adrenaline at various points, but of all the situations in David's life in 1 and 2 Samuel, this is the one time it says that David is afraid of another person. He's actually much afraid, in verse 12, of Achish, the king of Gath. Why is he so afraid? And if we zoom out to get the situation a little bit more clear, David, in the story, had gone pretty quickly from hero to hunted. Remember, Saul was the king of Israel, and after David's big victory, Saul brought David into his household. And David would play his harp, and it would drive the evil spirits away from Saul in his bouts of insanity and darkness. But David also emerged as a great military leader, so much so that the people in the land started that little song, Saul has killed his thousands, but David has killed his 10,000s. And that drove Saul crazy. And Saul wasn't aware that behind the scenes, Samuel had already anointed David, that David was destined to be the king. All Saul knew was that there was a threat in his own household. And so nowhere became a safe place for David. He had no place to run. And when Saul decided he was going to start pursuing David, David tried to go hang out with Samuel in Ramah. Saul chased him there. David tried to find a place at his own table in Saul's house, and his friend Jonathan, Saul's son, said, no, you can't stay here because Saul will kill you. Then David goes to the priests at Nob, and he gets Goliath's sword and a little extra bread because Saul is chasing him, and Saul comes after him there and eventually will kill all those priests who helped David. And so what's happening here is that David has no options at home for safety, and he heads to enemy territory toward the Philistines. That's where the city of Gath is. It's a Philistine city. And remember, this is the guy who killed his 10,000s, and then a lot of those were Philistine people. So this is a pretty desperate plan for David. to go into the heart of enemy territory, seeking refuge or asylum. But this was a few years before Facebook came out. So David was sort of hoping maybe he could fly under the radar and just hang out in Gath for a little bit. And he runs up to the gates and he's desperate. He's got nowhere to go. He's thinking, this is my last option. And all of a sudden he hears one of the servants of Achish singing, his 10,000s, this is the guy. And it strikes terror into his heart. He's recognized, he's exposed, he's alone, and he's on enemy territory, and he is afraid. He's exhausted all of his backup plans, and he realizes that now the situation is entirely outside of his control. This gate, he's standing there, he's got nowhere to go behind him. And the only direction he thought he had going forward is now closed to him. No options. And he's afraid. Now, turn your attention back to Psalm 34. If you notice the little superscript description, Psalm 34, of David, when he changed his behavior before Abimelech so that he drove him out and he went away. So this Psalm 34 is about the episode we just explored. And some of you might be saying, wait a second, I thought it was Achish over there in Samuel. What's this deal about Abimelech? And there are different theories about that. Some would say, well, maybe the scribes made a mistake and put in Abimelech instead of Achish. Others would say perhaps Abimelech was a title for a ruler in a similar way that Pharaoh was not the proper name of the king of Egypt, but more of a title. In any case, what we read in Psalm 34 interacts with this story of fear and craziness in 1 Samuel 21. Let me read it to you. I will bless the Lord at all times. His praise shall continually be in my mouth. My soul makes its boast in the Lord. Let the humble hear and be glad. Oh, magnify the Lord with me. Let us exalt his name together. I sought the Lord, and he answered me and delivered me from all my fears. Those who look to him are radiant, and their faces shall never be ashamed. This poor man cried, and the Lord heard him and saved him out of all his troubles. The angel of the Lord encamps around those who fear him and delivers them. Oh, taste and see that the Lord is good. Blessed is the man who takes refuge in him. Oh, fear the Lord, you his saints. For those who fear him have no lack. The young lions suffer want and hunger, but those who seek the Lord lack no good thing. Come, O children, listen to me. I will teach you the fear of the Lord. What man is there who desires life and loves many days that he may see good? Keep your tongue from evil and keep your lips from speaking deceit. Turn away from evil and do good. Seek peace and pursue it. The eyes of the Lord are toward the righteous and his ears toward their cry. The face of the Lord is against those who do evil, to cut off the memory of them from the earth. And when the righteous cry for help, the Lord hears and delivers them out of all their troubles. The Lord is near to the brokenhearted and saves the crushed in spirit. Many are the afflictions of the righteous, but the Lord delivers him out of them all. He keeps all his bones, not one of them is broken. Affliction will slay the wicked, and those who hate the righteous will be condemned. The Lord redeems the life of his servants. None of those who take refuge in him will be condemned. This psalm is quite a scene change from the story at Gath. I mean, David goes from drool on his beard to praise on his lips. And the great conflict, the great turn, the hinge of this psalm is right there in verse 4. I sought the Lord, and he delivered me from all my fears. As we said, this is a psalm rich in the language of fear. And in this series that we're doing here at Grace Snellville this spring, this winter, whatever season it is, depending on the weather, we're talking about how we can read these Psalms to help us practically in life. And this Psalm, Psalm 34, has much to speak to us practically about fear. Because part of sorting out human life is sorting out our relationship to fear. Elsewhere, 1 John in the New Testament, chapter 4, says that God is love, and then a few verses later it says, perfect love casts out fear. And if that's true, then life with God is not meant to be a fearful endeavor. But we still face fears all the time. I mean, fear is a real part of our lives. When we face big decisions, when we think about the future, when we consider our children, when we look at crises, fear is a very present reality, both in its physical response, which of course is the body dumping adrenaline into your system in the face of threat, but also in its psychological reality. The first question I asked, how many of you would like to live fear-free? What would it look like to live fear-free? How much fear do you manage on a daily basis? And there are certain things that amplify fear around us. In our culture these days, things are moving really fast, and so it's hard to feel like you have a sense of what's coming. You know, is there a war on the horizon? Is there a recession on the horizon? I don't know, things are moving fast. It seems like it's out of control. Our culture is pretty transient, more so than at any time in history. People move for jobs or are displaced for economic reasons. Families don't settle into a certain area the same way that they used to. And so there's this sort of question like, who are my people and how long will they be here? And how do I love my neighbor if I don't even know who my neighbor's gonna be a year from now? And then things are real complicated these days. And so for many of us, even just in our culture, there's this sense of fear. The Wall Street columnist Peggy Noonan wrote this. She said, something's up, and deep down, where the body meets the soul, we are fearful. We fear down so deep that it hasn't even risen to the point of articulation, that with all our comforts and amusements, with all our toys and bells and whistles, we wonder if what we really have is a first-class stateroom on the Titanic. Everything's wonderful, but a world is ending, and we sense it. Now, she wrote that in 1998. I don't know if it's gotten any better in the last 20 years. And we still have threats of war, and there's still plenty of nuclear bombs out there, and there's crazy germs just threatening pandemic. In the last 20 years, the incidence of terror attacks and shootings has risen. I mean, all of this stuff creates this underlying noise of fear that we have to kind of manage and decide to what extent we're going to listen to it or how we might not listen to it. And listen, we live in the most advanced, most powerful country pretty much in the world. People in other parts of the world live with fear on a much more visceral, daily basis. I remember about 10 years ago, we got invited over to China to hang out with some house church leaders there in several different parts of the country. And we were talking about how to love our Muslim neighbors and everything. And so in a couple of the cities, we would gather and we would meet in apartments. And so there'd be 15 or 20 of us, leaders, and a couple of us from the States. We'd be in the apartment. Every time somebody knocked on the door, you could feel in the room, everybody kind of go, like, is this the secret police coming to bust us and arrest us and deport us? It never was. Most of the time it was just somebody bringing food. But that's a whole different level of living with fear than most people in the United States have to manage. Now, how do we manage that? How do we handle that? What do we do with that fear, the personal stuff, the cultural stuff, just all of that? Now, in Psalm 34, you may have missed it as I was reading, but if you really soak in these words, you'll start to see that in Psalm 34, there is a condemnation of two failing strategies to deal with fear. And even though this is written a couple thousand years ago, those strategies in Psalm 34 are still strategies that we employ today. The first strategy that human beings will employ to manage fear, I'm going to describe as the way of the lion. That our response to fear and threat is to get stronger and conquer your fears. Back in the 90s, I remember I was so excited when I finally got one of those no fear t-shirts. Anybody have any of those sitting in your wardrobe? Okay, this is crazy. If you do, and if they're not horribly stained in the pits, like mine are, you can sell them. I was looking on eBay, they're like $90. But those no fear t-shirts, if you remember them, they were filled with these like super intense slogans. The one I got that I love so much is bottom of the ninth, down by 3, 2 outs, full count, no fear. But then there are other phrases on there, second place is the first loser. No fear. All killer, no filler, no fear. But it's that sort of language that spoke to me as a teenager. Of course, it was totally false advertising when I would wear that shirt, because your teenage years are lots of filler and lots of fear. But it spoke to me because it sort of evoked this idea like you could be this tough guy who's not threatened by anything, and you can just conquer your fears and conquer the world around you. And if you look at a lot of the writing that's given to leadership and for business stuff these days, blogs and other stuff, even this language of the lion imagery and all the rest, you can make yourself stronger, you can conquer, that it appears. I came across one blog written by a CEO. It talks about how to, learn the lessons of the lion so you can rise to the top. So the lion stays focused when it's hunting, and it uses rest and has a good diet to keep themselves king of the jungle. And they use a team to catch the prey. It's all very, red-blooded predator sort of stuff. You can just eliminate the distractions and get rid of anybody who keeps you from being who you're meant to be, and employ the right people. But you can catch echoes of that lion way, even in the way people will talk about protecting themselves, like I'm afraid of getting attacked. And so I went and I got a black belt, and now I feel more confident. And there's nothing wrong with like empowerment or getting a black belt in karate or some other martial arts discipline. But underneath that strategy, you can hear the sense that if I can just become strong enough or powerful enough or frightening enough or dangerous enough or focused enough, then I'll be able to really manage my fear. No fear. But in Psalm 34, interesting little verse, it's the 10th verse. The young lions suffer want and hunger, but those who seek the Lord lack no good thing. The young lions, the apex predator at apex health, still suffers want and hunger. There are no guarantees for the lions. David looks around at nature, and he says, even the most fearsome predator around sometimes goes hungry, sometimes doesn't have enough. The way of the lion is not a guaranteed way to escape what may threaten you. Now, there's a second failed strategy of dealing with our fear, and that shows up down at verse 13 when it talks about keeping your tongue from evil, your lips from speaking deceit, turn away from evil and do good, seek peace and pursue it. The language of deception begins to rise up. And so there is this other strategy. Rather than the sort of make myself stronger way of the lion so I can dominate the world into submission, this other strategy is just to live in delusion. This is the lying way. The psalmist says, keep your tongue from evil and your lips from speaking deceit. One of the ways out of fear and into Psalm 34 is to leave behind the lies. Sometimes we find ourselves insisting, I'm not afraid, I'm not afraid, I'm not afraid, I'm not afraid. And frankly, sometimes that's a lie. But the truth is buried so deep down that we're not able to face it yet. A lot of times we do stuff out of fear we don't even realize we have because we've built up so many layers of self-protection and control. Man, if I can just keep my diet healthy, I'll dodge disease. If I can just make enough money, then we can move to that house and it'll be the right neighborhood and my family will be protected. If I can just marry someone who makes me look a certain way, then I can dodge the fear that I'm not enough. And the way of lying shares something with the way of the lion. The way of lying or the way of delusion dealing with our fears, it also relies on the illusion that we are in control. So you can either use strength or you can use deception to delude yourself into thinking that you're in control of your life. And ultimately, when we start talking about fear, that's what we're talking about, isn't it? 800 years ago, Thomas Aquinas, great theologian for the church, wrote that whatever is entirely subject to our own power and will is not an object of fear. Nothing gives rise to fear save what is due to an external cause. Now, there's a reason a lot of people don't like reading 800-year-old theology because you're like, what does that even mean? Let me sum it up for you. If we feel like we can control it, we won't fear it. Nothing gives rise to fear save what is due to an external cause. We become afraid when we encounter things outside of our control. Fear comes from external causes. No, we feel it internally. And sometimes we have fears about ourselves that sense to be internal, but all of that stuff actually arises from the things that seem to be outside of our control. That's why the way of the lion and the way of lying are so attractive, because they kind of give us the illusion that if we can just get strong enough, or if we can bury it under untruth, then we can stay in control. So what's the answer? If these are the failed strategies in Psalm 34, what's the recommendation? What's the truth from the psalmist? And Psalm 34 actually boils down and summarizes one of the major, if not the major, theme of the Old Testament. There's an emphasis throughout the Old Testament on a one fear strategy. And that one fear is the fear of the Lord. In verse 7, the angel of the Lord camps around those who fear the Lord. Verse 9, fear the Lord, you his saints, for those who fear him have no lack. Verse 11, come children, listen, I'll teach you the fear of the Lord. Here's the central point of Psalm 34. In the fear of God, we find freedom from the fear of all else. Great. But what does it mean to fear God? This is one of the tricky phrases of the Old Testament. It's so important from Deuteronomy through to Job and the Psalms and Proverbs, but what does it mean to fear God? If I'm going to trade in all my other fears for the fear of God, what am I exactly trying to do? So Walter Brueggemann, one of the really sharp Old Testament scholars, writes this about the fear of the Lord. It's a short little paragraph. The testimony of the Bible is unambiguous. Believing persons are to learn to fear God. That's what Psalm 34 is talking about. The phrase fear God is elusive and for that reason misleading. It seems to include the notion of dread and terror before God. Because dread and terror are too heavy, however, our propensity or our natural impulse is to speak instead about awe. Awe. I don't know why I said that like New Englander. Awe. Wonder. Reverence. No. Is to speak instead of awe, wonder, and reverence. I suspect that the phrase in the Bible intends to include in its scope a great range of nuances that run from terror to wonder. Here's the important sentence. If we try to articulate all of these nuances in a single affirmation, we may suggest that fear of God means to take God with utmost seriousness as the premise and perspective from which life is to be discerned and lived. To fear God is to take God with utmost seriousness, to take God seriously as the foundation of our lives. And that means everything from incredible awe and wonder and reverence to maybe a hint of danger, dread, terror even, in God's greatness as the creator compared to our finite, created human existence. A one fear strategy, the fear of the Lord. And it's interesting because there's another psalm, Psalm 56, that also seems to reference this story of David at Gath that is lurking in the background of these words. And in that one, David says in verse 3, when I'm afraid, I put my trust in you, in God, whose word I praise, in God I trust, I shall not be afraid. Which is an interesting smushing together of two things. He starts off saying, when I'm afraid, and then he says, I shall not be afraid. And in the middle is trusting God. And the truth is, sometimes we have to come to the bottom of our fears before we can really shift to fear God. Because until we come to the bottom of our fears, we can still employ those strategies of, I'm going to be strong enough, I'm going to be tough enough, I'm going to grit my way through it, or I'm going to just delude myself, or I'm going to marginalize that, the way of the lion or the way of lying. But until we come to the very bottom of it, we're not really in a place where we're ready to trade that route in, exchanging it for a fear of God. Now, I think that's what happened to David at the gate. David's been running strategy after strategy after strategy. David, the creative warrior, he's coming up with everything. And finally, it all crumbles down when he's there before Achish at Gath. And this proud and accomplished, well-spoken, brilliant warrior, anointed king is reduced to a shockingly shameful humiliation. Writing on the walls, drooling all over his beard. I mean, this is David at his kind of lowest point. And yet when you come back to it in Psalm 34, David says, I sought the Lord, he answered me, delivered me from all my fears. How do we do that? In verse 4 that we just read, I sought the Lord. There's a part of learning to fear God that comes from learning to seek the Lord in the times of our trouble. Rather than seeking our strength or rather than seeking an alternate explanation, we seek the Lord. And that word, to seek, in Hebrew in the Psalms, is always used to speak of something known rather than unknown. This is not some like journey off into the unknown to discover. No. David sought the Lord. David was aware of who God is. David knew some of who God was, knew that God could be found. And so when David sought the Lord, David wasn't, starting off this quest of spiritual exploration to figure out what might be out there. David was saying, no, God, the Creator, I need your help now. And that's important because if we're going to learn to fear God, we need to know who God is first. Some of us in our journey to fear God are tragically hamstrung because we don't really know who God is. And so we seek the Lord, but we don't really know who the Lord is. It's more of a wandering and an occasional prayer, or God, I really need. We haven't actually spent the time with the scriptures to know who is this God whom we seek. But then secondly, after seeking the Lord, there's another invitation, taste and see that the Lord is good. It's the most well-known phrase from this whole psalm. And sometimes you'll hear it taught out of context. Just say, hey, experience God and try it out and see how God is. And there's certainly truth to that. But when we put it back into its context, the truth really begins to sing. Because the word taste is interesting. Taste, it can refer in Hebrew both to how something tastes in your mouth. Oh, that's spicy, or that's salty, or that is delicious. But it also can refer to your discernment. Now, we have the same thing in English. If we say someone they dress well, we can say they have good taste in clothes. They have great discernment about what they wear. We'll say, oh, you have good taste in, cheese or wine, or you have good taste in cars, or good taste in friends, or whatever it is. We use that phrase in the same way. Well, up at the top, when it says that David changed his behavior before Abimelech, you know what the word is up there? Taste. When David was at the gate and he changed his behavior, in Hebrew it literally says he changed his taste before Abimelech. Now, what in the world does that mean? It's like one of those things like, interesting. But what does that mean? To taste and see that the Lord is good means to develop a taste for the fear of God. In a sense, when David goes crazy at the gate in Gath, he is giving up all sense of control. If you have an appetite for control, if you have a taste for control, you will live with a bellyache of fear. But if you can learn to change your taste, to taste and see, to take God with utmost seriousness, to let your sanity be in seeing the goodness of God, then you can live fear-free. And surrendering your taste for control actually looks crazy to the outside world. That's what's so powerful about that scene at Gath. The moment where David kind of throws up his hands and like, okay, and he's spitting on his beard and everything else. David's surrendering his control in that moment. He's totally just throwing his hands on, okay, here's this crazy plan, and God, you're going to have to do something. To the outside world, that looks crazy. And it's the same today, isn't it? When we start taking God with utmost seriousness, it can raise eyebrows in the world around us. What? You're going to give 10% of your income to a church? What? You're gonna get up early on Sunday morning to sing songs and listen to some guy monologue? What? You're not gonna have sex before you get married? What? You're gonna move your family where? To the Muslim world? See, when we start giving up control, we actually start taking God with utmost seriousness. It looks crazy to the outside world, but it actually might be the way to live fear-free. And that's why David says, taste and see that the Lord is good. But we can't do it alone, and that's what the first 3 verses are about. We sing to the Lord together. That's what the psalmist is saying. This whole psalm is an invitation. This is not just David saying, hey, let me tell you what I learned. This is David saying, hey, you people of God, listen to my story. I know what it's like to be afraid. I know what it's like to run the way of the lion and try to overcome my fears and my strength. Didn't work. I know what it's like to lie to myself and try to avoid my fears that way. Doesn't work. But here, let me call you to praise God. And the world's going to look at you and they might say, you're crazy, and send you off. But actually, that might be the safest place you can be. But you can't do it alone. You need some people. And here's what's crazy is a couple, not crazy, there's too much craziness in this story to use the word crazy the way I was using it. But here's the amazing thing, right? Immediately after David, isolated, is freed from the threat there at Gath, he goes and hangs out in a cave called Adullam, and it says that the people who are disenfranchised, the poor, the weak, the humble, started to gather to David. And that was the beginning of David's counter-revolutionary movement, the rebellion, the resistance, to use Star Wars sort of language. But a couple chapters later, David comes back and he's got a community, and he comes to Gath, and then he finds refuge in Gath. So it's not when David's alone, but when David has a community surrounded by humble people who also understand what's happening, that his insanity becomes sanity and his life becomes fear-free. And that's the last piece. If we're going to learn the one fear strategy, yes, we need to taste and see that the Lord is good. Yes, we need to seek the Lord, but we need to sing to the Lord together so that we can remind each other. There are certain days when the righteous are struggling. I don't know if you've ever had that. You've ever come in on a Sunday morning, you're like, I'm kind of righteous, but I'm struggling. Well, David says at the bottom of the psalm, the righteous have many afflictions, verse 19. Many afflictions for the righteous. It's not many fears for the righteous, many afflictions for the righteous. But the Lord delivers him out of them all. But the invitation here is that if you're righteous and you're dealing with affliction and you're trying to do it on your own, it is trouble. When you gather and you have a community, come, sing together. Let's magnify the Lord. Let us exalt his name together, verse 3. This is what carries us through the seasons when we feel like the only righteous person dealing with afflictions, tempted to go back to fear. David says, if you want to learn the fear of the Lord, seek the Lord, know who he is, taste and see the Lord. Sing to the Lord in community. I could go on. Thank you for that encouragement. This is a daily practice. I'll finish here. This is a daily thing. I deal with fears on a regular basis. I was thinking about this week about the fears that I have to manage personally. In my family, I got my kids, and it's easy to start fearing for their future. In my marriage, I say, God, how's this all going to play out? We got these young kids. We hardly have any time for each other. I think in my job here at Grace, I can think about seasons, about stepping into this role. I was afraid to step into this role almost 6 years ago. I know every Monday we open up the email we get from the finance office that shows us the offering, and there's a fear in clicking on that. One of the other campus pastors said when he gets that email on Monday afternoon, he goes, "Do any of you guys say big money, big money, big money when you click on it?" And I mean, there's all these things are temptations to fear. Change your taste. Sometimes you have to be afraid in order to learn the fear of God. And here in this story, what we see with David is he comes to the bottom of his fear and he says, okay, I got to trade that in and exchange it for a real fear of the Lord. So let's pray together. Lord, teach us to fear you so that we won't fear anything else. Lord, if we're here this morning and we're living with lies or we're relying on our own strength to control circumstances, Lord, would you just help us to see that? And Lord, together we seek you this morning. We come to you and we say, okay, you're the mighty, creator, powerful, transcendent God who is love, but you're not to be trifled with. We come to you, Lord. We seek you. We cry out to you. We say, help us with all our fears. Show us what it means to taste and see you. And Lord, even as we sing to you together now, would you, by your Spirit, be at work in the deepest places of our hearts? Many are the afflictions of the righteous. We understand that. We know that. But Lord, let us fear only you. Let us take you seriously. And Lord, let us in that find peace and confidence that we will not lack. In the name of Jesus.